Hi everyone, I'm Julie Cefalu, and my tip for you today is all about that perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. So when you're making a quilt, you'll hear the term scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I want to tell you why that's important and what it is. So scant means less than 1/4 of an inch, and when you're piecing your seams, what I like to do is I press my seams to one side or the other rather than open. So some of that fabric gets folded over itself, and so that fold over of fabric takes up room in the seam allowance, and the thread itself takes up space in that seam allowance. So if you use a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, it's going to allow for those things to happen and still get a unit that measures what it should instead of shrinking or growing. So let me show you the tools that I use to set up my machine for that perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. So there's two tools that I like to use to get my 1/4 inch seam allowance just right. And one of them is this little guide. This is the Perfect Piecing Seam Guide by Perkins Dry Goods. And it's basically a ruler that has a hole in it for your needle to go into, and it's a scant 1/4 inch from the needle to the edge of the ruler. So I'm going to use that in conjunction with, this is a sewing edge reusable vinyl stop. So I'm going to place this right along the edge of my ruler, and it's going to provide me that guide for my 1/4 inch seam allowance. So let me just show you how I set that up. The ruler is going to go underneath my presser foot, and I'm going to bring the needle of my machine down through that hole that I just showed you. And once I've got that needle in place, I want to make sure that ruler's coming straight off of the machine. So I can use the throat plate to make sure that it's lined up with that if necessary, or you can eyeball it. So you lower your presser foot so that's nice and stationary. And then I'm going to take a piece of that sewing edge, and all you need is really about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. And we're going to place this right along the edge of the ruler. And you want to make sure that you're putting it in front of your feed dogs, not over your feed dogs. And right next to the edge of the ruler like that. So this is, it's a temporary, it's repositionable, but it gives you a lip or an edge to guide your fabric through your machine. Once that's in place, I'm going to get this ruler out of here. So lift your presser foot and the needle and take the ruler away. And now I have a guide for my fabric to go against. So let me just show you how I'm going to put some of my pieces through here. I suggest, to test your 1/4 inch seam allowance, that you take 3 rectangles that are 2.5 by 6.5 inches and sew them together. So here are 2 of them that I'm going to place right sides together, and I'm going to sew these using that vinyl strip as my guide. So I've got my starter scrap in place, and I talked to you about this in one of my previous tips, but I'm going to sew from my starter scrap onto my strip. And you can see that this just butts up right against that purple edge. And the nice thing about this is it feeds the fabric straight into your machine. So you know how often you'll have the beginning and ending of your stitching tends to be a little bit wobbly. Well, this will help prevent that. But I use my finger and I just place it right on that edge, and I make sure that my fabric is pressed against the edge of the tape as it goes through. And I'm going to stitch all the way down. And once I get to the end of this, I'm going to stitch off of this and onto another thread saver or starter scrap, whatever you want to call it. Clip my seams. Okay, here's one. Then I would sew another rectangle to the other side of this, and then press your seams really well. And here's one that I've done already. It should look like this, and once it's pressed, you should have it measure 6.5 inches square. So if you put a 6.5 inch ruler up here, I'm not sure if you can really see this well, but I've got a perfect sized square that is 6.5 inches from edge to edge, and that tells me that my 1/4 inch seam allowance is just right. So I hope that helps you as you do as you make your own quilts, so that you get a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. And thank you for joining me today.